The turkey glistened under the dining room chandelier, its skin burnished to a deep golden brown that seemed to glow. 22 pounds of perfection, basted every 30 minutes since dawn, with butter I'd melted myself and herbs I'd grown in the garden bed by the kitchen window. Rosemary, thyme, sage that I'd dried in bundles hanging from the pantry ceiling. The scent had been filling the house since 4 in the morning, working its way into every corner, every closet, every breath. My hands still smelled like it, earthy and warm, mixed with the faint sting of onion and the sweetness of cranberries I'd simmered on the stove. My back ached from standing, from bending, from reaching into the oven over and over to check, to baste, to worry. But when I finally carried that bird to the table on my grandmother's serving platter, the one with the tiny chip on the rim that no one else ever noticed, I felt something close to triumph. Robert stood at the head of the table like a king surveying his kingdom. The carving knife gleamed in his hand, and his smile was wide and easy. Our daughter Jessica held up her phone, filming him like he was about to perform surgery or cure disease. The grandkids, Noah and Emma, were already reaching for the rolls I'd baked in batches of 12, their little hands leaving flowery fingerprints on the linen napkins I'd ironed that morning. My son Mark poured wine into the crystal glasses I'd hand-washed and polished until they sparkled. The good glasses, the ones we only used for holidays. "Look at this bird," Robert announced, sliding the knife through the breast meat with theatrical precision. The blade cut clean and smooth, and juice pooled on the platter, cooked to absolute perfection. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, a dish towel draped over my shoulder, still wearing my apron. Watching. Waiting. Nobody looked my way. Robert raised his wine glass, and the chatter died down. Even the kids went quiet, sensing the moment. "To family," he said, his voice filling the room the way it always did, confident, warm, certain. "And to the ones who know how to provide." Glass touched glass all around the table. Everyone smiled, everyone murmured agreement. Jessica said, "Here, here," and Mark nodded like his father had just said something profound. I stayed where I was, my hands folded over the towel, watching the light catch in the wine and dance across their faces, watching my family celebrate a meal I'd spent 2 days preparing, a meal I'd shopped for, budgeted for, cooked with these tired hands while everyone else slept. Then Robert turned to me, still smiling, still holding that knife like a scepter. "Evelyn just lives here," he said. The words came out light, casual, wrapped in the tone of an easy joke. "She brings nothing." The room didn't stop. That's what people never understand about moments like this. The world doesn't freeze. Time doesn't stand still. Everyone kept laughing. Someone, I think it was Mark's wife, asked for the gravy boat. My son-in-law reached for seconds of stuffing, my stuffing, the recipe my mother taught me 40 years ago, and told Robert it was the best he'd ever tasted. Jessica giggled behind her phone. "Oh, Dad," she said, like he was being charming. I felt the towel slip from my shoulder. I caught it before it hit the floor, folded it carefully, smoothed the edges with my thumbs until every crease was perfect. Then I turned and walked back into the kitchen. The oven was still radiating warmth. The counters were covered in evidence of the meal, mixing bowls, measuring cups, the turkey baster lying in a puddle of its own grease. I stood in the center of it all, under the yellow overhead light, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something that had been building for 30 years, accumulating like sediment at the bottom of a river, and had finally solidified into something I could name. I walked to the drawer by the window, the one that stuck unless you pulled it just right. Inside was a leather folder, old and worn at the corners. I hadn't opened it in months, but I knew exactly what was inside. That was the night he said I brought nothing. That was the night everything changed. Morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of November dawn that makes you want to stay in bed forever. But the house didn't care about comfort. It demanded attention. Everyone had left the night before. Bellies full, hearts light, voices still echoing with laughter about Robert's toast and his perfectly carved turkey. I'd heard the word hospitality twice before they drove away. Once from Jessica as she kissed my cheek at the door. Once from Mark as he thanked his father for hosting such a great Thanksgiving. Hosting. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the aftermath. Plates crusted with dried cranberry sauce were stacked in towers threatening to topple. Serving bowls with congealed gravy formed a small mountain next to the faucet. The turkey carcass sat on the counter like an accusation, bones picked clean, nothing left but the skeleton of something that had been beautiful hours ago. I turned on the water. Hot. Hotter than I needed. My hands turned red under the stream, the skin prickling with pain, but I didn't adjust the temperature. I just stood there, letting it hurt, watching steam rise and fog the window above the sink. Robert was still asleep upstairs. He always slept well after Thanksgiving. Full. Satisfied. Comfortable in the knowledge that everything had gone perfectly and he'd been the star of the show. I picked up a plate and scrubbed it with more force than necessary. The floral pattern started to fade under the scouring pad. 30 years ago, we stood in this kitchen together. It looked different then. Linoleum floors instead of tile, laminate counters instead of granite, a window that didn't seal properly and let in cold air even in summer. Robert had put his arm around me and said, "We'll fix it up together. Make it perfect." I'd leaned into him and said, "As long as it's ours." Ours, he'd agreed. Always ours. But the paperwork told a different story. His name went on the mortgage application because his credit score was higher, or so he said. My name went on the down payment check. $20,000, every penny I'd saved from working at the county library before we got married. Money I'd been careful with, deliberate with, protective of. Money I'd trusted him with. "It's just easier this way," he'd explained, pen hovering over the signature line. "The bank likes seeing stable income and good credit. It's just paperwork. The house is ours. You know that." I'd believed him. Why wouldn't I? We were married. We were partners. What was his was mine, and what was mine was his. That's what marriage meant. For 20 years, I paid that mortgage. Every single month. On time. Even when he couldn't. Especially when he couldn't. In 1998, when he lost his job at the manufacturing plant, I picked up double shifts. I worked the library desk from 8 to 4, then changed into my diner uniform and served coffee and pie until midnight. I learned to sleep in the car between jobs. I learned to make a single sandwich last 2 meals. I learned that you could smile through exhaustion if you had to, and I had to. He never asked where the mortgage money came from. He never questioned how the bills got paid when his checking account was empty. He just nodded when I said everything was fine. Grateful. Relieved. Comfortable. And I kept paying. I scrubbed another plate. The gravy came off in greasy brown streaks that swirled down the drain. 30 years of payments. 30 years of keeping this roof over our heads. 30 years of bending my back and swallowing my pride and holding everything together while he slept soundly beside me. And last night, he'd told our family I brought nothing. I set the plate in the drying rack and wiped my hands on the towel. Then I walked to the oak desk in the corner of the living room, the one my mother had left me when she died, the one with the bottom drawer that stuck unless you knew exactly how to pull it. I pulled it just right. Inside was the leather folder. I lifted it out carefully, reverently, like it was something holy, because in a way, it was. I opened it slowly. The house deed lay on top, thick paper, official seal pressed into the corner, and there, in bold black letters, Evelyn Grace Carter, just my name, no one else's. I ran my fingers over the embossed text and felt something warm spread through my chest. Not anger anymore. Something else. Power. The kitchen table we had back then was small and cheap, the kind you buy at a discount furniture store when you're young and optimistic and think you'll replace it with something better once you make more money. It wobbled if you leaned too hard on the left side. I'd wedged a folded napkin under one leg to keep it steady. Robert sat across from me with his head in his hands. The layoff letter lay on the table between us, wrinkled from where he'd gripped it too hard, the fold lines deep enough to tear through. March 1998. I remember because it was exactly 1 week after Jessica's 10th birthday party, the one where we'd rented a bounce house and Robert had walked around in his company polo shirt. shaking hands with the other fathers, talking about his upcoming promotion like it was already decided. 2 days later, they called him into the manager's office and let him go. Budget cuts, they said. Nothing personal. Last hired, first fired. I don't know what we're going to do, Robert said. His voice was hollow, scraped clean of its usual confidence. The mortgage is due in 2 weeks, Evelyn. 2 weeks. And I've got nothing. No severance package, no backup plan, nothing. I reached across the wobbling table and covered his hand with mine. His skin felt cold despite the warmth of the afternoon. We'll manage, I told him. How? I've been looking at our accounts. We've got maybe $300 after the utilities. $300. That won't even cover half the mortgage payment. I'll pick up more hours at the library. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. You're already working full-time. Then I'll find something else, a second job. I can waitress at night. I've done it before. Evelyn. We'll manage, I repeated, squeezing his hand harder. I promise. We'll get through this. He didn't argue. He just nodded, letting his head drop back into his hands, grateful that someone else was going to solve the problem he couldn't fix. That was March. By May, I was working 73 hours a week. The library gave me all the overtime they could spare. The diner on Route 9 hired me for evenings and weekends. I learned to change clothes in gas station bathrooms. I learned to survive on coffee and determination. I learned that you could function on 4 hours of sleep if you had no other choice. Robert stayed home. I'm sending out resumes, he'd say when I called during my break, making contacts, following up on leads. But when I came home at 1 a.m, exhausted and smelling like fryer grease, he'd be asleep on the couch, TV still playing, empty beer bottles on the coffee table. I didn't say anything. I just kept working. In June, the mortgage payment was late. I paid the $50 late fee out of my tip money. In July, the electric bill bounced. I paid it in cash at the utility office, standing in line during my lunch break, apologizing to the woman behind the counter. In August, Robert asked if we could go out to dinner. Just once, he said. I need to feel normal again, like things aren't falling apart. I said yes. I always said yes to him. We went to the Italian place on 5th Street. He ordered wine, expensive wine, the kind we used to drink before the layoff when we thought we were secure. I ordered water and suggested we share a pasta dish. When the check came, he looked at me with those tired, grateful eyes. I paid. For 18 months, I paid for everything, every bill, every grocery run, every tank of gas, every little thing that kept us afloat while he looked for work that never seemed to materialize. Then, in September 1999, Robert got hired at a new company. The pay wasn't as good. The benefits weren't as comprehensive. But it was steady. He came home that first day, threw his new briefcase on the couch, and smiled his old smile, the one I'd fallen in love with. We made it, he said. I smiled back. We did. He never asked how. He never said thank you. He never acknowledged the sacrifice. He just went back to being Robert, the provider, the man of the house, the one who made everything work. And I went back to being Evelyn, the one who lived there. But I kept every receipt, every bank statement, every canceled check, every proof of payment. I kept them in a leather folder in the bottom drawer of my mother's desk, just in case. I sat at my mother's desk for nearly an hour, the leather folder open in front of me like a book of secrets. The afternoon light slanted through the living room window, catching dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. The house was silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional groan of the furnace kicking on. The deed sat on top of everything else. Heavy paper, the kind with texture you could feel under your fingertips. An official seal pressed into the bottom right corner, gold foil that caught the light. And there, in bold black letters that seemed to absorb all the light in the room, Evelyn Grace Carter. Not Evelyn and Robert Carter. Not Mr. and Mrs. Robert Carter. Just me. Only me. Underneath the deed was the closing statement from November 14th, 2019, 6 years ago. The day I made the final mortgage payment. The day I paid off 30 years of debt completely and entirely in my own name. No co-signer, no joint ownership, no man's signature beside mine. I ran my finger down the payment history attached to the statement. 30 years compressed into columns of numbers. Every month, every year, every payment made from my account with my money under my name. The history was spotless, not a single late payment after that first one in June 1998, not a single missed month, just a steady, relentless march toward ownership. There was a photograph tucked in the back of the folder, its edges soft with age. Robert and me, standing in front of this house on the day we moved in. I was so young then, 34, with dark hair and hope in my eyes. I was smiling at the camera, my arm around Robert's waist. He had his arm around my shoulders, pulling me close, his expression proud and possessive, like he'd won something. In a way, I suppose he thought he had. I closed the folder carefully and leaned back in my mother's chair, the one I'd reupholstered twice over the years, the one that creaked in a familiar way when you shifted your weight. The morning light had shifted, grown stronger, painting golden rectangles across the hardwood floor. Somewhere upstairs, Robert was still asleep. The dishes were still in the sink, the turkey carcass still sat on the counter. But none of that mattered right now. I thought about Thanksgiving dinner, about the way Robert had stood at the head of the table with that carving knife gleaming in his hand, about the way he'd smiled when he said, "I brought nothing," about the way everyone had laughed, not cruelly, but casually, like it was obviously true, like everyone understood that I was just the woman who lived here, the one who cooked and cleaned and faded into the wallpaper, the way no one had corrected him, the way Jessica had giggled, the way Mark had nodded along, the way they'd all accepted his version of reality without question. I thought about the phone call last week. Jessica's voice, bright and cheerful. "Dad says you can just bring dessert this year, Mom. We don't want you to stress." Like I was a guest. Like this wasn't my home. Like I hadn't been feeding this family for 3 decades. I opened the folder again and pulled out the deed, holding it up to the light. The paper was thick and substantial in my hands. Real, undeniable, legal. If Robert wanted to tell people I brought nothing, if he wanted to erase my contributions and take credit for everything I'd built, then he needed to see exactly what I owned. He needed to understand that the roof over his head belonged to me. The walls that sheltered him were mine. The foundation that held everything together had my name on every document that mattered. I stood up carrying the folder to the copy machine in the corner. A small one I'd bought for managing household files and recipes. I made 3 copies of the deed. One I returned to the folder. One I tucked into my purse, and one I slid into a manila envelope, sealed it carefully, and set it aside. The light through the window had turned honey-colored now, the kind of afternoon glow that makes everything look softer than it is. But I didn't feel soft. I felt solid, clear, certain. If he said I brought nothing, he would soon see what I owned. Everything he thought was his. The call came 3 days later while I was folding laundry in the bedroom. Robert's undershirts worn thin at the collars, his socks, the navy ones he wore to work every day, his button-down shirts that I'd been washing and ironing for 30 years. My phone buzzed against the dresser. Jessica's name lit up the screen with a photo of her smiling face, the one from her college graduation, when she'd been so proud and I'd been so happy for her. "Hi, honey," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder so I could keep folding. "Hey, Mom." Her voice had that particular brightness that I'd learned to recognize over the years. Too cheerful, too casual. The tone she used when she was about to say something she thought I wouldn't like, but was going to present as good news. "So, Dad and I were talking about Christmas." I set down one of Robert's shirts and smoothed the sleeves carefully. "Okay. We thought it might be nice to do things differently this year. You know, keep it simple. Less stress for everyone, more relaxed." I waited, saying nothing, letting the silence stretch until she had to fill it. "Well, Dad's going to handle the main course this year, the ham or turkey or whatever we decide. And I'm bringing all the sides. Potatoes, vegetables, the works. Mark's taking care of drinks and appetizers." "I see. So we thought, and this is totally just to give you a break, Mom, because you do so much every year. We thought maybe you could bring dessert, something easy, nothing elaborate, just cookies or a pie. Whatever you want, low pressure." I picked up another shirt, folded it, set it on the pile. Just dessert. Yeah, you spend so much time cooking every holiday. We thought you'd appreciate not having to do the heavy lifting this year. You deserve a break, right? The bedroom was quiet, except for the soft rustle of fabric and the sound of my own breathing. I looked at the pile of Robert's clothes in front of me. 30 years of washing, drying, folding, putting away. 30 years of invisible labor that no one thought to acknowledge because it simply appeared. Done. Like magic. Did your father suggest this arrangement? I asked carefully. A pause. Just a beat too long. We all talked about it. It just made sense. I see. You're not upset, are you? Because we really did think... I'm not upset, honey. Oh, good. Because we just want you to enjoy the holiday, too. You're always so busy hosting and cooking and cleaning up. This way you can actually relax. That's very thoughtful. So, you're okay with it? Just dessert? I looked at my reflection in the dresser mirror. Same face I'd always had. Same tired eyes. Same woman everyone had learned to overlook. I'm perfectly fine with it, I said. Cookies, you said? Or pie, or whatever. Totally your choice. I'll bring something special. Perfect. Okay, love you, Mom. Love you too, sweetheart. I ended the call and set the phone down. Then I stood there in the silence, looking at the pile of Robert's laundry, thinking about how my role in this family had been reduced to dessert. How they'd divided up Christmas dinner and assigned me the smallest, easiest, least important part, the afterthought, the thing you bring when you're not really contributing, but everyone wants to be polite and include you anyway. I walked downstairs. Robert was in the living room watching a football game, feet up on the ottoman I'd bought at an estate sale and refinished myself. He didn't look up when I entered the room. Jessica called, I said. Yeah? What did she want? She said I'm bringing dessert to Christmas dinner. He glanced at me, then back at the TV, shrugged. Makes sense. No point in you knocking yourself out like you do every year. This way you can actually enjoy the holiday. Right. You okay with that? I looked at him. Really looked at him. At the way he sat in my house, in my chair, surrounded by things I'd paid for, maintained, kept beautiful and functional. At the way he assumed this was all his domain, his kingdom, his space to rule and make decisions about. I'm fine, I said. He smiled, satisfied. Good. You deserve a break. You work too hard. I turned and walked back upstairs, back to the laundry that wouldn't fold itself, back to the endless domestic tasks that everyone benefited from, but no one saw. They were dividing more than the meal, I realized. They were dividing me out of the family entirely, one small piece at a time. But they had no idea what they were doing, or what I owned. The text came on a Sunday morning while I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper spread out in front of me. The kind of quiet morning that feels stolen from the rest of the week. No demands, no schedules, just the soft sound of pages turning and the warmth of the mug between my hands. My phone buzzed against the table. Robert's name appeared on the screen, even though he was upstairs. Even though I could hear the shower running through the ceiling. Even though we were in the same house and he could have simply walked downstairs to talk to me. I opened the message. Let's keep things simple this year. Don't make it awkward. I read it 3 times, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger, not yet. Just a creeping awareness that this was intentional. This distance, this reduction, this slow erasure of my role in our family. Awkward. I set down my coffee cup and typed back carefully. Don't worry. I won't. 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again, like he was writing and deleting and writing again, trying to find the right words to control a situation that was already slipping away from him. Finally, good. Just want everyone to have a nice time. I set the phone face down on the table and stared at the newspaper without reading it. The words blurred together into meaningless shapes. Awkward. That's what he was worried about. Not my feelings. Not the humiliation he'd caused me at Thanksgiving. Not the years of invisible labor he'd dismissed with a single joke. He was worried that I might make things awkward by mentioning it, by being difficult, by refusing to pretend everything was fine, by existing too loudly in spaces he'd decided belonged to him. I heard the shower shut off upstairs, heard his heavy footsteps crossing the bedroom floor, heard the familiar creak of the closet door opening. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. 5 minutes later, Robert appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in weekend clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, hair still damp. He poured himself coffee from the pot I'd made an hour earlier and leaned against the counter, casual and comfortable. "You see my text?" he asked. I did. "So we're good?" I looked at him over the rim of my cup. At this man I'd spent 30 years building a life with. This man who'd forgotten, or maybe never knew, that the life we'd built had been constructed primarily by my hands, my money, my relentless determination to keep us afloat. "We're good," I said. He smiled, relief washing over his face like sunlight. "Great. I knew you'd understand. You always understand." He walked out of the kitchen, coffee in hand, whistling something tuneless under his breath. Content, secure, utterly unaware that the foundation he stood on was mine and mine alone. I sat at the table for a long time after he left, staring at my phone. Then I opened my Photos app, scrolled back through weeks of pictures, grandkids, garden flowers, meals I'd cooked, found the photo I'd taken a week ago when I'd first pulled out the leather folder, the house deed, clear and sharp and undeniable, my name in bold letters. I forwarded the photo to myself at 3 different email addresses, saved it to the cloud, downloaded it to my computer, backed it up on a thumb drive I kept in my jewelry box. Then I deleted the entire text thread with Robert, every message, every conversation, every casual erasure. He wanted to keep things simple and not awkward. He had no idea how true that was about to become. I don't know why I even bothered making the pie. Maybe it was muscle memory. 30 years of holiday preparations had trained my hands to reach for flour and sugar without thinking. Maybe it was pride, the stubborn part of me that refused to be reduced to store-bought cookies in a plastic container. Maybe I just needed something to do with my hands while my mind spun in increasingly angry circles. Pumpkin pie, Robert's favorite. The recipe I'd perfected over decades, adjusting the spices year after year until I'd found the exact ratio that made people close their eyes when they took the first bite. I rolled out the crust on the counter I'd saved 3 months to replace after the old laminate had cracked. Mixed the filling in the bowl my mother had given me as a wedding present. Preheated the oven I'd had repaired twice with my own money. Did everything exactly the way I'd done it for 30 years. But halfway through, my phone rang. Jessica's name on the screen. "Mom, quick question. Do you have Grandma's gravy recipe?" I wiped flour from my hands onto my apron. "I do. Can you text it to me? Dad wants to make it for Christmas, but he can't find his copy. He's really excited about it. It's actually kind of sweet. He's been watching cooking videos all week." Something sharp twisted in my chest. He wants to make it. Yeah. He's really getting into this whole hosting thing. Mark said he's never seen Dad so focused in the kitchen. It's actually really cute. I looked at the pie filling waiting in the bowl. The crust I'd rolled thin and perfect. The oven heating to exactly 425 degrees. "I'll send it," I said. "You're the best, Mom." "Oh, and he also wanted to know if you have the recipe for those candied yams you make, and the cranberry sauce with the orange zest." "He wants all of them?" "He's really going all out. I think he wants to prove he can do the whole traditional dinner. Man stuff, you know? Very adorable." I closed my eyes. My mother's gravy recipe. The one she'd taught me when I was 16, standing at her stove, learning to whisk the flour into the drippings until it was perfectly smooth. The one I'd made every single Thanksgiving and Christmas for 30 years. The one that people requested specifically, that my grandchildren asked for by name. Robert was going to make it now. Take credit for it. Receive praise for it. "I'll send them all," I said quietly. "Thank you so much. Love you." She hung up, and I stood there with my phone in my floury hands, staring at the pie, waiting to go into the oven. Then I smelled it. Burning. I spun around. Smoke was seeping from the oven door. I'd forgotten that I'd put the crust in to pre-bake while I made the filling. I yanked the oven open. Smoke billowed out, and I pulled out the pie pan with my bare hands. Stupid, not thinking, just reacting. The crust was black around the edges, the bottom cracked and smoking. "Damn it," I hissed, dropping the pan on the stovetop. "What happened?" Robert's voice came from the doorway. Then he laughed. Not a small chuckle, a real laugh, loud and delighted. "Did you burn something?" Mark appeared behind him, drawn by the smoke and the laughter. "No way. Mom never burns anything." "First time for everything," Robert said, still laughing, already pulling out his phone. "I have to get a picture of this." Evelyn Carter, the woman who's never made a mistake in the kitchen, burned a pie crust. "It's not funny," I said, but my voice came out too quiet to matter. "It's a little funny," Mark said, grinning. The great Evelyn Carter, defeated by a pie. Robert snapped a photo. "I'm sending this to Jessica. She won't believe it." My phone buzzed a moment later. Jessica's voice came through on speakerphone from Robert's cell. "Wait, Mom burned something? This is historic. Should we mark it on the calendar?" They all laughed, together, at me, while I stood in my kitchen with burned hands and a ruined crust and 30 years of invisible competence suddenly visible only because I'd finally failed at something. I smiled. I even managed a small laugh, because that's what you do when your family is mocking you and you don't want to make things awkward. But inside, I felt something else. Something hot and sharp that I'd been swallowing for 3 decades. I looked at Robert, still grinning, still holding his phone like he'd captured something precious. And I thought about my mother's gravy recipe, about the candied yams, about the cranberry sauce, about every recipe I was about to send him so he could play chef while I brought cookies. I smiled wider and swallowed my fire for one more day. My grandson Noah came over on a Wednesday afternoon. 9 years old, all elbows and energy, with my daughter's eyes and his father's habit of asking questions that made adults uncomfortable. I was in the garden when he arrived, pulling weeds from the flower bed that ran along the front porch. November had turned the garden brown and brittle, but I still found weeding meditative, the simple act of removing what didn't belong, making space for what would grow in spring. "Grandma," Noah called, running across the lawn. "Hi, sweetheart." I sat back on my heels and smiled at him. He dropped down next to me, immediately picking at a blade of dead grass. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He was quiet for a moment, his small fingers shredding the grass into tiny pieces. "Grandpa said this house is his." The trowel I was holding slipped slightly in my grip. "He said that?" "Yeah. He said when he's really old, like super old, it'll be Dad's house. And then maybe mine when I'm a grown-up." I set the trowel down carefully. My hands were shaking. "When did Grandpa tell you this?" "Last week. I asked if I could have a key, like Dad has, for emergencies and stuff. Like if you guys were on vacation and needed someone to water the plants or something." "That's very thoughtful of you." "But Grandpa said no." Noah looked up at me, his expression confused and a little hurt. "He said it's not a everyone gets a key kind of house. He said it's his house, so he decides who gets keys." Something cracked open in my chest. Cold air rushed in. "What did your dad say?" Noah shrugged. "He just laughed, like Grandpa was joking, but he wasn't joking. I could tell." I looked at the house. The porch I'd painted myself 3 summers ago, choosing the color carefully from dozens of samples. The shutters I'd replaced when the old ones rotted through. The front door I'd refinished, stripping away years of old paint until the original wood grain showed through. The flower bed I was kneeling in, full of perennials I'd planted and divided and replanted as they grew. His house, the house I'd paid for, the house I'd maintained, the house that had my name, and only my name, on every legal document that mattered. "Grandma, are you okay?" I realized I'd been silent too long. I looked at Noah's worried face and managed a smile. "I'm fine, honey. How about we go inside and get some lemonade?" "Okay." He jumped up and ran toward the house. I stood more slowly, my knees aching, my hands still trembling slightly. Inside, I poured lemonade into glasses while Noah chattered about school and his science project, and whether I thought dinosaurs would have made good pets. I nodded and made encouraging noises, but my mind was elsewhere. Robert was already writing me out of the narrative, already telling our grandson, our 9-year-old grandson, that this house was his inheritance to pass down through the male line. already making decisions about who got keys, who belonged, who had the right to claim space in a home I'd built. They were already moving me out of my own house, one small assumption at a time. Noah finished his lemonade and ran outside to play. I stood at the kitchen sink, watching him through the window, and felt something harden inside me. I walked to the junk drawer and pulled out the spare key ring. 5 keys hung from it: front door, back door, garage, shed, and one for the deadbolt I'd had installed after a spate of break-ins in the neighborhood 2 years ago. I took the key ring upstairs to my jewelry box, tucked it in the back, under the pearls my mother had left me and the watch I never wore. If Robert was deciding who got keys to my house, he was going to learn a very expensive lesson about property ownership. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Robert, listening to him snore, that deep, rattling sound that had annoyed me for years, but that I'd learned to sleep through because what choice did I have? But tonight, it kept me awake. Or maybe it wasn't the snoring. Maybe it was the echo of Noah's words. Grandpa said this house is his. At 2 a.m, I gave up. I slipped out of bed, pulled on my robe, and walked downstairs in the dark. The house was different at night, quieter, somehow more mine. During the day, it filled with other people's presence, other people's assumptions, other people's claims on space I'd created. But at night, it was just me and the walls I'd paid for. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the oven. Cold, dark, unused since the burned pie. Then I walked to the living room and pulled out the leather folder from my mother's desk. I looked at the deed for a long moment, running my fingers over my name, feeling the weight of 30 years of payments in the thickness of the paper. I needed another copy. Somewhere safe. Somewhere Robert would never think to look. At 2:30 a.m, I got dressed, grabbed my purse, and drove to the 24-hour copy shop on Main Street. The kid behind the counter looked half asleep and didn't ask questions when I used the self-service machine to make 3 more copies of the deed. I drove home in the darkness, the copies on the passenger seat beside me. Back in the kitchen, I stood holding the envelope thinking, where could I hide it where Robert would never look, where it would stay safe and dry and undiscovered? The oven. Robert never cooked, never had. Even when he'd announced he was making Christmas dinner, I knew he'd be asking me for help with every step, watching YouTube videos, calling me into the kitchen every 5 minutes with questions. The man couldn't boil water without supervision, and Jessica never used my kitchen. She was a takeout girl, always had been. Mark didn't even know where I kept the measuring cups. I opened the oven door and crouched down, looking inside. The top rack sat high and level. I slid the manila envelope all the way to the back, behind where the roasting pan would sit, behind where anyone would look if they happened to open the door. Then I closed the oven and stood back. Perfect. The deed would sit there in the dark, safe and hidden, waiting. Proof of ownership in the one place in this house that was entirely mine. The place where I created warmth and sustenance and everything that held this family together. It felt right, poetic almost. The proof of the house hidden in the heart of the home. I went back to bed and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. Robert never stirred. He had no idea I'd been gone. He had no idea what I'd hidden. He'd never think to look where I kept the warmth. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at the grocery store, standing in the produce section trying to decide between Honeycrisp and Fuji apples. The kind of mundane decision that makes up most of life. The small choices that no one remembers but that somehow matter in the moment. My phone rang. Unknown number. I almost sent it to voicemail, but something made me answer. Hello? Mrs. Carter? This is Linda Hernandez from First National Bank. I stopped walking, my hand frozen on an apple. Yes? I'm calling with some wonderful news. Your mortgage account has been officially closed and archived. The property at 428 Maple Street is now fully paid off and recorded solely in your name. I wanted to call personally to congratulate you. I stood there in the produce section, holding a bag of apples I didn't remember picking up, and felt my throat tighten. Mrs. Carter? Are you still there? Yes, I'm here. We're sending the official documentation by mail, the satisfaction of mortgage and updated title documents. But I wanted to reach out personally. It's not every day we get to make a call like this. 30 years is a significant achievement. You should be very proud. Thank you, I managed. According to our records, the closing date was November 14th, 2019. Does that sound correct? November 14th, 2019. I did the math in my head. That was exactly 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. 2 weeks before Robert had stood at the head of the table and told everyone I brought nothing. I'd owned the house, completely, legally, undeniably, for 6 years. Through 6 Thanksgivings where I'd cooked the turkey. 6 Christmases where I'd decorated and baked and hosted. 6 years of being treated like a guest in my own home, while the deed sat in my desk drawer with only my name on it. Mrs. Carter? Yes, that's correct. Wonderful. The documentation should arrive within 7 to 10 business days. If you have any questions about the title or need additional copies for your records, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you. And again, congratulations. This is a remarkable accomplishment. She hung up. I stood in the produce section of the grocery store, surrounded by pyramids of apples and oranges and pears, holding my phone and my bag of apples, and felt something rise in my chest. Not anger anymore. Not sadness. Something else. Relief. Clarity. Power. I'd paid off the house 2 weeks before Robert had humiliated me. 2 weeks before, he'd stood in front of our family and erased 30 years of my contributions with a single joke. 2 weeks before, he'd forgotten that I'd kept the roof over his head. The timing was perfect, almost biblical in its irony. I put the apples in my cart and continued shopping. But everything felt different now. Lighter. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter. The piped-in music sounded almost cheerful. I moved through the aisles with a new certainty, picking up groceries with hands that no longer trembled. By the time I reached the checkout, I was smiling. The cashier, a young woman with purple hair and tired eyes, looked at me curiously. "You seem happy." "I just got some very good news," I said. "Well, that's nice. We could all use more good news." I drove home with the windows down despite the November chill, letting the cold air rush through the car, feeling awake and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. The timing was perfect, and soon everyone would know it. Christmas came cold and bright, the kind of winter day where the sun makes everything look sharp and crystalline. The house smelled like ham and cinnamon and pine from the tree in the living room corner, the tree I'd decorated while Robert watched football, just like every other year. But I hadn't cooked the ham. That was Robert's domain now. He'd been in the kitchen since 7 in the morning, wearing the apron I'd bought him as a joke 5 years ago that he'd never worn until today. Playing chef, playing provider. Jessica arrived with green beans and rolls from the expensive bakery downtown. Mark brought wine, good wine, the kind you buy when you're trying to impress someone. I brought cookies. 2 dozen sugar cookies I'd made the night before, decorated with simple icing. Nothing elaborate. Nothing that required real effort. Just like they'd asked. We gathered around the dining room table, the same table where Robert had carved the turkey 6 weeks ago. The same chairs, the same light streaming through the windows, the same family. But I felt different. I was different. Robert stood at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, smiling around at everyone with that proud, satisfied expression I'd seen 1,000 times. The expression of a man who believed he'd accomplished something. "Before we eat," he announced, "I want to say something." The room quieted. Everyone turned to look at him. Noah and Emma stopped giggling over something on Noah's phone. Jessica set down her water glass. Mark straightened in his chair. "This year has been good to us," Robert continued. "We're healthy. We're together. We have this beautiful home to gather in." His eyes swept around the table, touching each person briefly. When they landed on me, they moved on almost immediately, like I was part of the furniture, part of the house itself, present but not particularly noteworthy. "And I'm grateful," he said, his voice swelling with warmth, "to be surrounded by family, by people who contribute, who actually bring something to the table." He raised his glass higher, and the light caught in the wine, making it glow like amber. "So here's to family," he declared, "and to the ones who actually bring something." Laughter rippled around the table. Jessica clinked her glass against Mark's with a bright, cheerful sound. Noah reached for his juice with both hands, careful not to spill. Emma giggled at something Mark's wife whispered to her. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of the envelope in my purse. I'd brought it with me, one of the copies I'd made, sealed in a fresh manila envelope, just in case I needed it, just in case this was the moment. Robert sat down, still smiling, and reached for the serving fork to begin carving the ham he'd spent all morning preparing. That's when I stood up. The movement was quiet, but something about it made everyone stop. Forks paused halfway to plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned to me. "Evelyn?" Robert said, his smile faltering slightly. "You okay?" I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope, set it on the table in front of me with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The table went completely quiet. "What's that?" Jessica asked. I looked at Robert. Only at Robert. "I brought something," I said softly. I slid the envelope across the table. It came to rest right next to the ham, the golden Christmas light catching on the manila paper. "Evelyn," Robert said slowly, "we're about to eat. Can this wait?" "Open it," I said. "This really isn't the time. Open it." The room was so quiet, I could hear the heater clicking on in the basement, could hear someone's phone buzzing on silent in another room, could hear my own heartbeat. Robert sighed. That particular sigh that meant I was being difficult, being dramatic, being too much. He set down his fork and reached for the envelope, tore it open with more force than necessary, pulled out the paper inside. I watched his face change, watched confusion become recognition, become something else, something that might have been fear. "What is it?" Mark asked when Robert didn't speak. Robert still didn't answer, just stared at the deed like it might disappear if he looked at it long enough. Jessica leaned over to look. Her eyes went wide. "Is that the house deed?" "Yes," I said. My voice was steady, calm, clear. "This house, 428 Maple Street." "Okay," Mark said slowly, glancing between Robert and me. "Why are we looking at this now?" I kept my eyes on Robert. "Because your father seems to have forgotten whose name is on it." The silence that fell was absolute. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. Jessica took the paper from Robert's hand with slow, careful movements. Read it. Read it again. "Mom, this is only your name." "That's correct, but I always thought it was both of you." "You thought it was your father's house," I said. "Everyone did, because that's what he told you." That's when I reached for the envelope and changed everything. For once, he couldn't find his words. No one moved. No one ate. No one even seemed to breathe. The ham sat steaming on its platter, untouched. The wine sat in glasses, undrunk. The carefully prepared sides Jessica had brought from the expensive bakery downtown sat getting cold. Even Noah and Emma were quiet, sensing that something seismic was happening, something that would be talked about for years. Jessica held the deed in her hands, reading it over and over like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense, something that fit the narrative she'd grown up believing. "Mom," she said finally, her voice small, "I don't understand. Dad always said, he always talked about the house like it was his, like he'd built it for us. I know what your father said." Robert stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound. "Evelyn, can we talk about this privately? In the other room?" "No. This is completely inappropriate. This is Christmas dinner. This is not the time or place." "Is it?" I looked at him, really looked at him, let him see 30 years of accumulated anger in my eyes. "Was it appropriate when you told me I bring nothing? In front of our children? In front of our grandchildren? During Thanksgiving dinner?" That was a joke. It wasn't funny. Mark took the deed from Jessica's trembling hands and read it himself. I watched his face change as he processed what he was seeing, watched him understand. "Dad, this is just Mom's name. No joint ownership. Nothing." "It's more complicated than it looks," Robert said. His voice had gone tight, defensive. "There's community property laws, marriage laws. It's not as simple as—" "It's very simple," I interrupted. "I paid for this house. I paid the $20,000 down payment in 1989 with money I'd saved from working at the library before we got married. I paid every single mortgage bill for 30 years. Every single one. Even when your father couldn't. especially when your father couldn't. Evelyn, Robert started. I paid it off in November 2019, November 14th to be exact. 6 years ago. The title is clear. The deed is in my name, only my name. I own this house, alone, completely. I picked up my water glass and took a sip. My hand didn't shake, not even a tremor. So when you say, I bring nothing, I continued, setting the glass down with a soft click. When you tell our grandson this is your house, when you divide up Christmas dinner and relegate me to cookies because I apparently don't contribute enough to merit a real role. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Just remember who brings the roof over your head. The silence was so complete, I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, could hear the furnace humming in the basement, could hear my own heart beating steadily, calmly, certain. Robert's face had gone from red to white. We're married, he said, and his voice shook slightly. It's community property. California law. We don't live in California, I said calmly. We live in Ohio. And I checked. I checked with 3 different lawyers, actually. Had consultations. Asked very specific questions. This house is mine. The deed is in my name alone. The title is clear. There is no community property claim, because I purchased it with money I earned before our marriage and paid it off with money from accounts in my name only. I paused to let that sink in. And if we were to divorce, I said softly, letting that word, divorce, drop into the room like a stone into still water, I would keep it, all of it, the house, the property, every single square foot you've been pretending belongs to you. The room was so quiet I could hear Jessica's breathing had gone fast and shallow, could hear Mark muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer or a curse. Mom, Jessica said, and her voice cracked. Why didn't you ever tell us? Because I didn't think I needed to. Because I thought your father knew. Because I thought after 30 years of marriage, after building this life together, respect was a given, not something I had to prove with legal documentation. I looked at Robert. He wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at the ham he'd spent all morning cooking, at the meal he'd been so proud of, at his moment of glory that was dissolving around him. But apparently, I continued, I bring nothing. I'm just someone who lives here. Someone who cooks and cleans and maintains and pays for everything, but doesn't really count because I don't make a show of it. Because I do it quietly. Because I don't demand credit and praise for every single contribution. Evelyn, please. Robert's voice was barely a whisper now. My name is on the deed, Robert. My name is on every payment record. My name is on the title insurance. My name is on the property tax documents. My name is on every single piece of paper that matters when it comes to determining who owns this house. I stood up and walked to where he was standing at the head of the table, stood close enough that he had to look at me. And my name, I said very softly, so softly that everyone had to strain to hear, is the only name that matters. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. For the first time in 30 years, Robert Carter had absolutely nothing to say. Mark picked up the deed and read it aloud, his voice shaking slightly. This property belongs solely to Evelyn Grace Carter, paid in full, no lien, no encumbrance, no co-owner. He set the paper down and looked at his father, then at me, then back at his father. Jessica had tears on her cheeks. Dad, is this true? Did you really tell people this was your house when it wasn't? Robert sank back into his chair slowly, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore, and the silence that followed was finally, completely his to bear. Christmas dinner ended without anyone eating. The ham grew cold on its platter. The sides Jessica had brought so carefully remained untouched. The wine stayed in glasses that had been raised for a toast that now felt like a cruel joke. Even the cookies I'd brought, the simple, easy contribution I'd been assigned, sat on their plate, untouched and unwanted. I walked everyone to the door one by one. Mark left first, carrying Emma, who'd fallen asleep on the couch during the terrible silence that had followed my revelation. He kissed my cheek, whispered, I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know. I know you didn't, sweetheart. Jessica lingered on the porch, her coat only half buttoned despite the December cold. Her eyes were red, and she kept pulling a tissue from her pocket to dab at them. "Mom," she said, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Dad always made it sound like he'd done everything, like he'd bought the house and paid for it and taken care of us all by himself." "I know, honey. Why didn't you ever correct him? Why didn't you ever tell us?" I thought about that question, considered giving her the easy answer, that I hadn't wanted to make waves, hadn't wanted to embarrass her father, hadn't wanted to seem petty or small. But I was done with easy answers. "Because I thought he knew," I said. "I thought he remembered. And I thought that someday, without being asked, he might acknowledge what I'd done, what I'd sacrificed, what I'd built. But he didn't. No, he didn't." Jessica hugged me then, long and tight and fierce. When she pulled back, her eyes were still wet. "Are you going to be okay?" "I'm fine," I said. And I meant it. I've been fine this whole time. I've just been waiting for everyone else to notice. After they left, I went back inside. The house felt different, heavier somehow, fuller of truth than it had been in years. Robert was still sitting in the living room, not watching TV, not doing anything, just sitting in the chair by the window, staring at nothing. I walked past him to the kitchen and started putting food away, wrapping the ham, covering the sides, stacking dishes in the sink, performing the familiar rituals of cleanup that I'd performed 1,000 times before. He followed me, stood in the doorway like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to enter. "Evelyn." I kept working, scraped plates, ran water. That was humiliating. I turned around slowly and looked at him. Was it? In front of our children, in front of Noah and Emma. "You humiliated me." "Did I?" I leaned back against the sink and crossed my arms. "You humiliated me 6 weeks ago, in front of the same people. But I didn't interrupt your dinner. I didn't make a scene. I didn't correct you. I just stood there and took it. That's different." "How?" He didn't have an answer, opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. "You told our grandson this was your house," I said, my voice calm and even. "You told him you decide who gets keys. You told him this property would pass from you to Mark to him, like I don't exist, like I'm just living here at your pleasure." "I didn't mean it like that." "Yes, you did. You told me I bring nothing. You let Jessica and Mark divide up Christmas like I was an afterthought, like my only role was to bring dessert to a family gathering in my own home. I was trying to give you a break. You were erasing me," I said, slowly, piece by piece, reducing my role until I was barely visible, until I was just the woman who lives here, not the woman who owns here. The kitchen fell quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. "I need some time," Robert said finally, "to think, to figure out this." "Figure out what exactly? The facts are very simple. This is my house. I own it. That's not complicated." "I need time to figure out how I feel about it," he clarified. "About living somewhere that isn't mine. It was never yours, Robert. You just didn't know it." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes, something that might have been fear or might have been the first glimmer of understanding. "I'll stay at Mark's for a few days," he said quietly. "Okay, maybe longer. That's fine." He left the kitchen. I heard him climb the stairs slowly, like each step was an effort, heard drawers opening and closing, heard the zipper on his suitcase, that particular sound that means someone is leaving. 20 minutes later, he came back down with his bag in hand, stopped at the front door, turned back to look at me. "I don't know what you want me to say," he said. "I don't want you to say anything," I told him. "I want you to understand, to really understand that I built this, that I kept it standing when you couldn't, that I've been holding everything together for 30 years while you took credit for it." "I know that," he said softly. "Do you?" He looked at the floor. "I'll call you in a few days." "Okay." He walked out. I heard his car start in the driveway, heard the sound of tires on asphalt growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing but silence. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I walked to the living room and sat down in his chair, the big leather recliner by the window that he'd claimed as his own 15 years ago. It was comfortable. I'd never sat in it before, had never even considered it. I looked around the room, at the pictures on the walls that I'd hung, at the curtains I'd sewn, at the coffee table I'd refinished, at the bookshelf I'd painted, at the life I'd built, piece by piece, with my own hands and my own money. The house was quiet, empty of everyone but me, and it was mine. I didn't need revenge. I had something better. I had the deed. A week passed in strange, peaceful silence. No one to cook for, no one to clean up after, no one to accommodate or diminish myself for. Just me and the house and the winter light coming through clean windows. Robert called twice. Brief conversations that felt like two strangers making polite small talk. How are you? Fine. Me too. Good. Silence. I need more time. Take all the time you need. On the 8th day, his car pulled into the driveway mid-afternoon. I was in the garden, cutting back the dead perennials, preparing the beds for winter. I saw him through the bare branches of the dogwood tree I'd planted 20 years ago. He got out slowly, carefully, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be here anymore, like he was visiting someone else's house instead of returning to what he'd always thought was his own. Evelyn. I stood up, brushing dirt from my knees. My gardening gloves were muddy. My coat was old. But I felt more myself than I had in years. Robert, can we talk? Of course. We sat on the porch steps. The afternoon was cold but clear, the kind of winter day where everything looks etched in crystal. The garden looked peaceful in its dormancy, resting, gathering strength for spring. I've been thinking, he said after a long moment, about what you said, about the house, about everything. I waited. I didn't realize, he continued slowly, choosing his words carefully, how much you did. I mean, I knew you worked. I knew you helped with bills, but I didn't realize you'd carried us, I finished. He nodded. Yeah. We sat in silence. A cardinal flew to the feeder I'd hung from the maple tree. Its red feathers looked impossibly bright against the gray branches. I'm sorry, Robert said finally, for what I said at Thanksgiving, for making you feel invisible, for making you feel like you didn't matter. Thank you. But I don't think I can stay here, he continued. Not like this. Not knowing that it's yours and not mine. Not knowing that everything I thought was true about our life together was actually different. I looked at him. It was always mine, Robert. You just didn't know it. I didn't hide it. The papers were always there. The deed was always in my name. You just never looked, never asked. Never wondered whose signature was on the mortgage payments every month. I know, and that's the problem. I don't know how to... He trailed off, searching for words. I don't know how to be in a home that I don't own, that I never owned. That was never really mine. He stood up. So did I. I'm going to move in with Mark, he said, for a while, maybe longer. We can figure out the rest later. Lawyers, paperwork, whatever needs to happen. Okay. I'm not trying to punish you, he said. I can't be here right now. I understand. He looked at me for a long moment, like he wanted to say something else, like there were words caught in his throat that he couldn't quite speak, words that might have been apologies or accusations or just bewilderment at how we'd arrived at this moment. Then he turned and walked to his car, got in, started the engine. I watched him drive away for the second time, watched until the car disappeared around the corner, watched until there was nothing left but the empty street and the quiet afternoon. Then I went back to the garden, picked up my clippers, kept working. The house hummed behind me, warm, solid, paid for, mine. No arguments, no shouting, no drama, just a quiet shift, a necessary ending, a truth that had finally come to light. I didn't need revenge. I had never needed revenge. I had something better, something real, something that couldn't be taken away. I had the deed. 3 months later, spring arrived slowly and then all at once, the way it always does. One day the trees were bare, and the next day they were covered in that particular shade of green that only exists in April, bright and new and full of promise. I painted the kitchen yellow, the color I'd always wanted but Robert had said was too bright, too cheerful, too much. It'll make the room feel smaller, he'd insisted. But he'd been wrong. The yellow made everything feel open and warm, like the room was full of sunlight even on cloudy days. I rearranged the living room, moved the couch away from the TV and toward the window so I could watch the garden while I read. I'd spent 30 years arranging furniture around Robert's preferences, around his comfort, around his need to see the television from his chair. Now I could arrange it around light and view and my own small pleasures. I planted roses in the front bed, pink ones with a scent that reminded me of my grandmother's garden, the kind that bloom prolifically and require patience but reward you with armfuls of flowers all summer long. Jessica came by often. She helped me paint. We didn't talk about Robert much. She'd mention him in passing. "Dad's doing okay at Mark's place," or "Dad said to tell you hello." And I'd nod and say, "That's good." And we'd move on to other things, better things, our own relationship, separate from him. Mark visited on weekends with Noah and Emma. We'd bake together, the three of us covered in flour, the kitchen full of laughter and the smell of sugar and butter. Real cookies, the kind that take time and patience and create memories. One Saturday morning in early May, Noah and I were working in the garden together. I was showing him how to plant tomato seedlings, how to dig the hole deep enough, how to be gentle with the roots. "Grandma," he said, carefully patting soil around a seedling. "Is this still your house?" The question didn't hurt anymore. "Yes, honey, it is." "Good," he said seriously. "Grandpa's apartment is nice, but it doesn't smell right." "What does it smell like?" He thought about it, his face scrunched in concentration. "Like nothing. Like it's just a place where someone keeps their stuff. Your house smells like home." I smiled and handed him the watering can. "Want to water these?" "Yeah." We worked together in comfortable silence. The kind of silence that feels full instead of empty. The kind that comes from being comfortable with yourself and the person you're with. Robert and I signed the divorce papers in April. It was simple, clean, civilized. He took his pension and his car and his tools from the garage. I kept the house and everything in it. At the final meeting, sitting in the lawyer's office with papers spread between us, the lawyer asked if we wanted to say anything to each other. Robert looked at me across the table. "I'm sorry it ended this way." "Me too," I said. And I meant it. Not sorry for the ending. The ending was necessary and long overdue. Sorry it had taken so long to get there. Sorry we'd wasted years pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Sorry he'd never seen me clearly enough to understand what I'd been giving. On a Tuesday morning in May, I woke up early to sunlight streaming through my bedroom window. Not our bedroom anymore, just mine. I'd changed the curtains to something lighter, something that let in more light. Had bought new sheets in a color I loved. Had claimed the entire space as my own. I made coffee in the yellow kitchen. Good coffee. The expensive kind I used to save for guests and special occasions. Now every morning was a special occasion. Every day was worth celebrating. I carried my cup to the front porch and sat on the steps looking at the garden. The roses were blooming, pink and full and more beautiful than I'd imagined. The tomatoes were leafing out. The herbs in the bed by the kitchen window were already big enough to harvest. The house was quiet behind me. No one to cook for. No one to answer to. No one to make myself smaller for. No one to diminish what I'd built with my own hands and my own money and my own relentless, invisible strength. Just me. I thought about Thanksgiving. About the carving knife and the golden turkey and Robert's toast. About his words that had cut deeper than he'd probably meant them to. "She brings nothing." I took a sip of coffee and smiled. The steam rose in the cool morning air, and a breeze carried the scent of roses across the porch. I brought the down payment. I brought 30 years of mortgage checks that never missed a due date. I brought double shifts and late nights and early mornings. I brought the kind of quiet, relentless strength that holds families together when men fall apart. I brought forgiveness when I should have brought accounting. I brought patience when I should have brought demands. I brought roses and yellow kitchens and the deed with only my name on it. I brought the walls, and the foundation, and the roof over all our heads. I brought everything that mattered. They said I brought nothing. But in the end, I brought the house itself, and with it, my freedom and my peace. The morning light caught in my coffee cup, turning it golden. I took another sip and looked at my garden, at my roses, at my home, and I was finally, completely, undeniably happy. If this story gave you strength, help us by sharing, liking, and hitting the notification bell. We'd love to hear in the comments which part of the story you liked most. See you tomorrow.